Hey everyone. So this week the lessons are over money, banking, monetary policy. We'll start off though looking at inflation for this video. Just look at inflation for this one. First, we'll kind of look at some preliminary stuff here. So this is the new consumer price index summary put out by the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. All right, so they send out a random survey to people, a certain amount of the population, each month. And they're trying to get an idea or feel like for how much goods have cost, like how much are they paying for these goods. And they use that information to come up with they'll create an index from it. And from that, they'll ascertain how much prices are either increasing or decreasing each month. All right, let's just kind of go over this. So looking at all urban consumers, which is 85% of our population. So it rose 0.5% in January for all the goods that they use here. They use a basket. They have this basket of goods that tries to anticipate what the average household buys each month. Okay. So that basket rose 0.5% in January. Okay. So what that means, if it kept rising like that for every month, you would have 6% inflation. Is what you'd have for that. You just take that and multiply it by 12. Okay. Let's see. Now, what was it saying? It only rose 0.1 in December. I think that a lot of that was due to energy prices were really falling. This kind of picked back up. Now, looking at it from a year ago, prices have increased 6.4%. Okay. All right. Where did the biggest increase come? This is it came mostly from shelters, where it says the biggest increase came from. Let's kind of look at some of these other main ones here. Food rose 0.5, about the same as all items. Energy rose a good bit too. That's a significant rise. That's why energy, as you look at it, you can see it really fluctuates. Energy does. Yeah. And so it's kind of one of the reasons why they kind of exclude that on this one major called core inflation. That's what the central banks try to look at when they're determining policy, because it can kind of fluctuate so much. And some of that's really kind of out of their control, these kind of short-term fluctuations. So sometimes I'll look at core inflation to try to get an idea what they need to do with monetary policy. Anything else? All right. So of course, this is going to have an impact on your real wages. That is how much your wages can actually buy. And if you look here in January, and this is kind of unemployment's not bad. It's got a little bit lower than it was, and labor force participation is not quite what it used to be. But for some reason, people just aren't. Some of the people that just haven't really came back to work. So I don't really know a full explanation for that. But unemployment's really low. But one thing that people are experiencing is there's they're losing some of their because the cost of living has increased so much, and their wages aren't keeping up with that. The amount of goods they can actually buy is actually decreasing. Okay, so their standard of living is actually from what they can buy with the wages is actually falling a little bit. So that's the big concern, and that's why inflation is such a big deal, because a lot of times wages, because they're sticky and they don't adjust immediately, they're going to leave households with a lower standard of living because they can't buy as much. And so this is what happened. The average hourly earnings for all employees decreased 0.2% for December to January. So what their wage for each hour will buy decreased. Okay. So it stems from a 0.3% in average hourly earnings combined with an increase of 0.5% in the consumer price index. So wages actually rose 0.3%, but it wasn't enough to keep up with the rise in inflation. So the wages actually fell 0.2%. So if you did that for a whole year, that'd be like saying your average hourly earnings fell, 2.5%. Okay. Now, if you look at the real average weekly earnings actually increase. That's because people were actually working more hours. which means that a lot of people, maybe they're working part-time because that's all they could find. Well, some more people were able to find full-time work, which is good, which is a good sign here. But what's kind of bad is, that, people's real wages for hourly are actually decreasing. Okay. And that's why, the central bank right currently is really trying to do whatever it can to to lower the rate of inflation. That's the big concern now in the economy. Anything else? That should be it. So we'll go ahead and start with go back to our slides here. Okay. So this will come from chapter 22. So we'll look at some, some historical and recent trends in U.S. inflation. We'll talk about these different measures of inflation, what they did to calculate them. We'll talk a little bit about the effects of inflation on the economic participants here. Okay, so this is from the time period November 2020 to October 2021. It's showing these different categories, how big of a increase there was. So you can see gas is a big one. All right, something that can really fluctuate really strongly. Now, a lot of this isn't necessarily due to things that we've done. A lot of this, rise really kind of out of our hands. But when you see an overall increase in everything like this, well, it's something to do. It has something to do with government spending and what the central bank's done with monetary policy. They did this though to help stave off the recession that we're in, try to make it ended a lot quicker, which they did. They just kind of overshot a little bit. So obviously if they could have got it just perfect, it'd been great. But rather than do nothing and have the recession last longer, it's probably a little bit better to do this and overshoot a little bit and have a little bit of inflation. And because they're being pretty proactive now, they're doing what they can to raising rates to get this back under control. As you can see, there's been a good bit of inflation. This is the most we've experienced in a while. Usually it's been around 1 or 2% for the longest time. But it varies between each different type of goods. Okay. And some of that can do to the price elasticity of those goods. Certain firms are able to raise their prices easier than others. Like gasoline, well, people in the short run, they're still going to buy the same amount of gas because they got to drive to work and all that stuff. So that's one of the reasons why gas will fluctuate really quickly. Whereas some goods that are that aren't as inelastic, but maybe their demand is more elastic, or maybe they won't, the prices won't adjust as much because the firms lose so much sales as a result of that. All right, so the extreme case here of we just have just crazy amounts of inflation is what we call hyperinflation. Okay, so some examples of those would be Zimbabwe. It got up to, what was the percent? It doesn't show here, but anyway, so this $100 billion Zimbabwe that was issued in 2008. It's basically worthless. There's 100 billion of them, but they're not really worth much of anything. So it says here, 620 million Zimbabwe dollars were worth $1 US. All right, so they're not worth a lot. So what happens after a while, if it gets really bad like this, and the prices just changes, it just gets impossible to do business with it, right? And so a lot of times, people just use other currencies. And that's what happened in Zimbabwe. That's what's going on with in Venezuela right now. They're experiencing really high inflation. So different regions in in Venezuela are using different currencies. Some of them are using Brazilian reals. Some places are using the US dollar if they can get those in there. There's actually an old mining town where people are using little flecks of gold, using that to conduct exchanges to make economic transactions. Just because it's just really hard because their currency is losing so much value so fast, it's really hard to conduct business in it. Now, usually what sets these off is something really either a war or something going on with the economy. Like with Venezuela's case, there's a oil price shock where the price of oil just dropped dramatically. And since the government really depended on this oil industry to like fund itself, they tried to replace that by printing money to like buy its own debt. And when they did that, it caused, it started this chain where like you have this inflation is getting faster and faster, and the demand to hold money just keeps going down faster and faster. People spend the money, so people, when they start to see these prices starting to rise like this, well, as soon as they get paid, they'll go out and buy something. Even if they don't need it yet, they'll buy in advance. And this just causes just keep increasing at a faster and faster rate of inflation. Eventually we get hyperinflation, and there's really not much the government can do. The currency is basically essentially worthless, and people are having to conduct business using something else. All right, so here's the term for inflation. It's just a rise in the price level from one period to the next. And this is something, if you're experiencing inflation, that means it's like, rising, pretty consistently. Okay. So when some of the baskets of goods and services, this is how the Bureau of Labor Statistics, how they measure this. All right. They pick out surveys, they try to ascertain what the average household, what are the goods and services they buy each month. And that determines their basket. And then what they do is they send out a survey each month, and they'll get like, well, how much are you paying for these goods that are in your these goods and services? And then they'll take that and they'll adjust it and find the cost of the basket. And they'll use that to create their price index. All right, so here's look at some trends from in the US for inflation. Now this has spiked up recently. But as you can see, it was for the longest time, it fluctuated a good bit. Right. So this was during World War I, went to a lot of debt, like the government put a lot of money, and then like it kind of fell down here, like we went into a recession, like right after. It's the same thing here when we went into the Great Depression. And this is one of the big reasons why it was so bad, like this just fall in the price of goods. You really don't want this. You don't want any drastic deflation or inflation. You want to avoid those at all costs. Like a little bit of deflation wouldn't have been that big of a deal, but like I saw this large drop in the price of goods, and it lasted for a long period of time. It didn't jump back up. And because of that, that kind of extended them. And instead of having a recession, it went to like what's called the Great Depression. And then after the war, like you see these time periods where we have a lot of inflation. And then in the 70s, a lot of this was caused by OPEC forming and cartelizing and limiting the amount of oil we got. So that spiked our oil prices, the gasoline prices. And then the central banks really didn't know what they were doing quite as well as they do now. And so they weren't really able to ever get under control. And it finally, to actually get under control, where it was going to just keep running away and getting higher and higher and go to this hyperinflation level, Volcker jacked up interest rates really high. And so, it was like 18-20% or whatever. And this got the inflation under control. People are like, okay, they're serious about getting under control now. But then it caused like a short little recession here. Okay, but they were, they eventually got through that. And once they got through this recession, after Volcker did this, the central bank was kind of transparent. Well, we're going to try to keep inflation, around like 2%, kind of balance it with unemployment. And from that time until here recently is what's kind of known as a Great Moderation. Right? Experiencing really low rates of inflation here. They did a really pretty good job of like keeping it from getting that high. You see it mostly stayed around like 2.5%. Okay. Now let's look at some examples, some really high rates here. This was in 2019. So Sudan had a 331% increase. Zimbabwe 241. Lebanon 146. Argentina 40. Oh, they don't have Venezuela. Okay, there it is. There it is. Venezuela was 10,000%. Okay. So it's this extreme case where you just can't even use it like for money. These other ones are bad. Argentina is bad, 4%, but you can still conduct business in it. Like it's not just gotten completely out of control like in the case of Venezuela. But these are some bad ones as well. A lot of times it has to do with Lebanon, I guess probably because like there's been some like civil unrest there, and like being around, I guess being next to Syria probably hadn't helped it either, with the ongoing civil war there. Usually for these, there's something going on, like some civil unrest, a war of some kind, or something going on really drastically to cause this, to set it off, like at least to begin with. Yeah, that's kind of one of the reasons why, like, it's not all just a central bank in these Western countries that are industrialized. They're kind of stable. What's going on? Like, there's not a lot of civil unrest. That really helps a lot, and able to keep them to maintain like this low rates of inflation that they experience. All right, so how do we measure it? With the consumer price index, well, this is, like we said, we've mentioned where these consumers, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they send out these surveys to a random sample consumers, they try to ascertain, like, what is the average consumer like? What do they consume each month? And they send out a survey to get these people to tell, what did you pay for that? All right, and they get this information, and they conduct the price of it, and they create what's called a consumer price index. And the percent change in this index from one period to the next, that gives you the rate of inflation. Right? Like it mentions here, it doesn't give you, change in one person's cost. Like what it's trying to get is the average. Right? Different people buy different things, so everybody's rate of inflation is going to be different. This is one thing, when you get these really high rates, it really does hurt. It hurts poor people more than it does the wealthy. There's a lot of times food is something that really increases in price a lot, places to live. So if you're wealthy, you don't spend as much money on food. And a lot of times your house, your payments set in. It's you get a mortgage instead of like a rental payment that can go up each month. So it's going to affect everybody differently. Now, like I was mentioning, the central bank, a lot of times they try to ignore food and energy in the short run because those can really fluctuate a lot. So they'll look at what's called the core inflation index. So it looks at all these other things except they take out the energy and food. All right. So this can kind of tell them, like, okay, what do we need to do? Do we need to decrease the federal fund rates to like kind of spur growth, or do they need to raise it like they are now? Like, do we need to get inflation under control? What do we need to do here? All right, so there's some types of biases that make it kind of difficult to completely accurately, measure like the rate of change, like the inflation rate for everyone. One of these type of biases that they have to try to deal with is substitution bias. As they change this basket, they adjust it like every 2 years, and they determine, what's going to go in the basket, what's the average household do. Right? But in the meantime, though, these prices between different goods can change. And if these prices change, well, people can, they'll substitute away to something else that's similar to it. Right? So you need to be able to correct for this stuff. They have things in place, though, like if the price of a good changes a certain amount, well, they just assume that people substitute away to something else, and it'll adjust automatically. Also, new goods bias. And this is why they do it every 2 years now instead of like it used to be every 10. Because when a new good comes on the market, well, people are spending money on that, and the price of this good can change. And since it's not in the basket of goods, well, they're not really capturing that. Okay. And also the quality. They need some way to, if you just looked at the price of vehicles, you're like, well, they've increased a good amount, especially trucks. But you can't just look at it one for one, because like the trucks now have a lot more features than they used to. The backup, all the different safety features. There's just a lot more in them than there used to be. So you can't really compare it. And so they try to take that into account, and they try to make adjustments to take into account the quality. To try to eliminate the bias. Now, it's really hard to do that. Like that's probably the toughest one to deal with, is this quality bias. Okay. Well, some recent statements about these bias. They try to presume modest consumer substitution. They try to assume people substitute between steak and chicken, or between cars and bus fares. They're looking at like different brands or types of items, going to a less expensive type of brand. All right. So like maybe if the price of Coke went up a lot, maybe people would substitute away to like an off-brand cola or something like that. Quality adjustment. Sometimes it's not just a matter of size or quantity. So then it's kind of hard to do it. What they do is they kind of look and see, like, what are people willing to pay for it? How do they adjust for it? How much more they're willing to pay for? They try to adjust for it that way. That's something that's really kind of hard to do. That's probably the toughest one to get, completely right. And new product buy, like I mentioned, they try to update it every 2 years. So that way they can get these new items into it. That's why they try to correct for that. But in the meantime, stuff's introduced in between those 2 years, so you can't really capture it. So that's why this is they do a good job of this, and it's going to give you a good idea like what's going on with the price level, but it's not going to be. There's no way for it to be 100% objectively true. There's always like some things where you got to make value adjustments, or you're just not able to get them immediately. So here's kind of the weight. You see most of the weight towards housing. That's what most people spend their money on. And then of course food and beverages after that. Transportation is big. Medical care 8.9%. So this kind of gives you the weight of these different components of the CPI. And they determine this by sending out these surveys every 2 years to determine what people spend their money on. And that's how they do it. All right, so there's some additional price indexes. Producer, this is, what are producers, what are they paying for these commodities that are used in these inputs that they buy to produce goods? So sometimes this can this was increasing, before when we saw this big wave increase in the consumer price index, like the producers saw it first, then they passed it on to the consumer. So sometimes you can get an idea of what's coming if you look at this producer price index. Because if these manufacturers had to pay a lot more for these input goods, well, they're probably going to pass it on as much as they can to increase prices on you. The international price index, this is looking at goods that are exported or imported, what the change in the prices of those. The deflator. Now this is just looking at the goods that the U.S. produces. All right. So this is one that it's going to be. It's 100% objectively accurate, but the issue with this is there's a lot of goods that the households don't buy that we produce. Right? We don't buy goods that are produced for the military so this is part of it. So this is no good using that for us. And we buy a lot of our goods from foreign produced people. So that's why we can't really use GDP deflator, even though it's more accurate about what it does though. All right. So it gives an accurate measurement of the price changes in the goods that we actually produce. Here it's showing the CPI again from during what was called the Great Moderation for the most part here. As you can see, it fell here when it was getting really bad when Volcker clamped it down, but then it's kind of stayed steady, kind of around this 2.5%. That's kind of where it stayed at until it spiked up here recently. Like I said, I talked about at the start, right now it's currently 6.4. It got all the way up to 8 something. They've gotten it come down a little bit. Hopefully they can get it down to 4% this year. That'd be really great. And then maybe get down to 2% 2 years from now. You don't want to do it too fast because they're worried about causing a recession. But as long as they can get it trending down, it's a good sign. Now, so what's the problem? Some of the issues with inflation is that it makes prices act as a kind of a signal to signal what's going on with the economy. It's kind of how we ascertain it transmits information. If you're selling your good, the price goes up, what you can sell it for, it's going to, well, that means demand for my good is increased or whatever, more than other goods. It could just be the case that, the overall inflation rates increase, and that's why the price of your goods increase. It may not be anything to do with your demand. So so it may send bad signals because of that, and it makes it a little bit more difficult to conduct business. One of the things that it can redistribute purchasing power. So if you borrow money and then inflation jumps up unexpectedly, well, that's going to transfer purchasing power back to you. You're having to pay in dollars that aren't worth as much now. Okay, so that would be good. But if you're saving money, if you made an investment in like a CD or whatever, and it gives you a certain amount of return. Well, if inflation jumps up really high, well, then you're not getting as big a return as you originally thought. Okay, so in that case, it's hurting you. You know, it makes it difficult for long-term planning for business. Because a lot of the times when you're having high inflation, like you're spending time and energy on trying to deal with this inflation rather than working on innovations and other things. If you're an individual, it's going to make it harder for you to determine, well, how much do I need to save for retirement? All right. You know, if inflation is staying at 1 or 2% per year, well, then you can kind of, it's easy to do. But like if it's jumping around, and that's the thing about inflation, the higher it gets, the more volatile it is. Okay. As you can see here, you see these really big changes when it was really high here, but like it's kind of, now the changes are a lot smaller when you get to this period through here. All right. Whereas you see here, you have these big jumps down or up or down, either way. Like it's just the way it is. Like when you get to these higher rates of inflation. Right. All right, let's talk about inflation-driven redistribution of purchasing power here. How can you get hurt? Well, if you're just holding cash, you know, you're not getting any kind of return on it. If you're keeping it checking or savings account, maybe you're getting like 0.5%, 1%. Like it's not enough to cover the rate of inflation. So you're actually losing purchasing power. Okay. And your investments may not be able to keep pace with inflation. So because that, well, you may try to like take in more risky, make more risky investments. And as a result, you may end up losing money that you wouldn't have done if like it weren't for the fact that inflation rose so much. Okay. Just talking about how can you benefit. Like I say, if you take out a loan, like you said, if you're borrowing and if it's set, well, then you can actually benefit because you're paying back with dollars that aren't worth as much. So that's one of the cases where you can benefit. Let's see. Okay, so let's talk about minimum wage and how, you know, it's been increasing over time. It's up to $7.50 now. But like since 1985, it's actually been decreasing in real purchasing power. Okay. So this is something they could fix so easily. But they don't, because they like to have these debates on it, and like, you know, like they're and then they'll jack it up really quick, which is not what you want to do. You want to adjust it like gradually. And they could do that. Just all they have to do is just index it to inflation. All right. But for some reason they don't do that. So instead we have the real wages going down for people that earn a minimum wage. And when they have these, when they do decide to increase it, it's real sudden, and that causes issues as well. Yeah. When you have these wage increases, it's really not going to have anything much to do with like what's going on with inflation. It doesn't really contribute much to that. Okay. Here it shows how wage growth, as you can see, it's kind of fluctuating, kind of changing. But then we have these high bouts of inflation. Well, there's nothing standing out here with what's going on with wages here. Right. It's not really contributing to inflation. What it's doing, when you have these increases in labor productivity, yeah, it goes to wages, but it doesn't like contribute much to inflation. Okay, so one thing like I mentioned, what they should do, I think, to minimum wage is index it and have it adjust every year. This is something that is done and certain labor agreements, we have these cost of living adjustments, these COLAs. This is something where it adjusts automatically based off the inflation rate. And they use these index, the consumer price index, to do that. There'll be clauses where it adjusts, like the contract will adjust for it when you have these changes in the cost of living. So adjustable rate mortgages, these will actually adjust automatically. This is one of the key contributors to the housing crisis. All right, these rates adjusted up, and as a result, people couldn't make the payments anymore. They couldn't afford them. And so when you have a lot of inflation, that's going to adjust the interest rates that you have. Like it's going to track with it. So these interest rates are going to jump up if you have a lot of inflation. That'll make these adjustable rate mortgages actually increase. So what's another thing that the government does here? One of the things they index, well, they do this for Social Security benefits. They want to keep people's, their Social Security benefits. They want them to be able to buy the same amount of goods for them from one year to the next. And so how do they do this? Well, they use a consumer price index and index it accordingly. So if you had a 2% increase in Social Security, in the CPI from one year to the next, well, that's what they would increase people's Social Security benefits by, like 2%. Okay, so Social Security is indexed to this. The federal income tax code actually adjusts as well. So these different tax brackets will adjust automatically based on how much price levels increase from one period to the next. One way to protect yourself against inflation is to buy these inflation protected securities, or what they're called TIPS. Okay, so this is one of the risks when you're investing in bonds, like you're getting a certain amount of payment. And so if there's a jump in inflation where you could be losing, what you thought would have been an increase in purchase power, you may actually be losing value with it. But if you get one of these inflation protected securities, well, it's going to adjust upward, based on how much inflation is adjusting. Okay, so that's it for the section on inflation. I'll make another video here in a minute, going over money and banking and then monetary policy.